when I was in Bosnia, we had warlords. They were former Bosnian army officers, former Bosnian army officers that had a band of troops, and they had a territory, and they controlled it like a bridge. And if you crossed that bridge, you had to pay a fee or do whatever they wanted you to do. Well, it's the same kind of thing in Gaza. You had to deal with the Hamas and the local leadership of whatever they wanted you to do in order to be able to operate.
All right, October 7th, 2023, Hamas invaded Israel, and the world was shaken and continues to shake. Why? Why did they invade? What did they hope to gain? What are the causes of the conflict between not just Hamas, but Israel and much of the Arab world and Israel? Our special guest to help us to address these questions is our Dr. Teddy Bitner. He's our Chief Academic Officer here at Calvary and our Professor of History. So he's done a lot of studying here on this. But you're also a decorated military officer. You served in the Army during times of conflict around the world. And if I remember right, you served as an advisor to our European allies after your retirement, and even after coming here at Calvary. You came to Calvary here at 1999. We're glad to have you. Welcome to the conversation, Dr. Bitner.
Thank you.
And we also have as our normal team members here, two of us, Sean LePage, Chairman of our Ministry Studies program here at Calvary, and Dr. Josh Paxton, Director of the Burnham Center for Global Engagement and our missions programs. Welcome, guys. Tim's stepping out this time. He's recovering from some surgery, but he's going to watch with us. Well, while the current war in Israel began with the Hamas invasion, it had its beginning a long time before October 7th. So, Dr. Bitner, start us out with a historical background. What are some of the causes of the current conflict? Why does Hamas hate Israel?
We could start all the way back with the biblical history.
Yeah.
With Israel in the land, with
Right.
the Exodus and the United Kingdom, divided kingdom, Assyria, Babylon, Persia controlling the territory. Eventually, Alexander the Great coming in, and then Rome coming in 63 BC and controlling that territory from the Roman Empire era all the way through the Byzantine Empire era until the Arab Muslim invasion in the 7th century. That is all background that impacts modern history.
Yeah, that's 7th century AD too.
7th
right?
century AD,
Yeah.
yes, when the Arab Islamic invasion occurred. And the Arabs and subsequent caliphites controlled that territory all the way up until, with the exception of the Crusader era, with the Kingdom of Jerusalem from 1099 to 1187, it was controlled by caliphites. And then eventually the Ottoman Empire took control of that area in the 1500s and maintained control all the way up until the end of World War I. During that time frame, one of the issues here is the name Palestine. There was a series of Jewish revolts that occurred in the latter part of the 1st century and going into the 2nd that culminated in a revolt in the 130 ADs, where the Romans just got so fed up with these revolts that they actually changed the name of the area from Galilee and Judea to three versions of Palestine, three portions of Palestine. They called it Philistia, but in the English translation is Palestine. And that name kind of stuck from that in that region to some extent. The modern time frame, we have, and there were Jews present all the way even through the Babylonian captivity. But all through that time, there was Jewish presence in the land. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a Jewish Zionist movement, which began, led by Theodor Herzl and Chaim Weizmann, which led eventually to Chaim Weizmann working with the British government to create a homeland for the Jews in that area, which I'll call the Holy Land, just so it's not politically sensitive. During World War I, the British convinced Arabs to come in on their side to defeat the Turks. And they made promises to the Arabs about them being able to create their own nation states. They also made promises to the Jews. And so they were making promises to all of these people, and when the war ended, then they kind of got stuck with those promises. In 1915, the British promised the Arabs that they helped overthrow the empire, they could have an independent Arab state. There's the 1960, the Sykes-Picot Agreement gave Syria and Lebanon to France and Jordan and Iraq to Britain, with Palestine under international control. The Balfour Declaration, at the same time, which the UK Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour committed the British government to creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So now we have the same land promised to two groups of people, and of course, that became an issue.
Right.
In the aftermath of World War I, there were mandates that were created for the French and for the British in that area, and the mandate for Palestine fell under British control. And there was also an effort at that time to create a two-nation entity, or divide territory between the Jews and the Arabs. The Jews that were on the ground at the time generally accepted the idea. The Arabs did not. So there was a lot of pushback, and there was a series of rebellions occurred throughout the 1920s and 1930s against the British over this issue. There was a huge one that went from 1937 to 1939 that the British had to put down. Then the war happened, World War II. After the war, of course, we had the Holocaust and a huge disposition or displacement of Jewish populations of the survivors as a result of the Holocaust, with a lot of them wanting to get to Palestine. And the Germans actually, before the war, was trying to get Jews to Palestine too. They were attempting to work with the British to make that happen. They had a lot of pushback from the Arabs as a result of that. But okay, so after the war, the British still had the Palestine mandate. They still wanted to do this two divided Arab-Israeli or Arab-Jewish thing. Again, the Arabs were opposed to it. Eventually, there's a Jewish revolution that began in 1947. This is the War of Independence, 1947-1948 timeframe, where the Jewish nation emerged. They were attacked by 5 Arab countries around them to try to reduce them, and the Jews actually defeated that over the course of time. Since that time, there's been continued Arab-Palestinian activities against the Jews in that land in order to try to push them out and to completely take over that territory. And then, of course, that's where you get the phrase "from the river to the sea." That's become very popular today. So that's a really, really fast background of where we got today.
Let me ask a couple questions. I vaguely remember in the past that there was a thought that they would settle the Jews in Uganda. Was that before World War II, before World War I? Was that part of this? Uganda was British, and so I'm assuming it's part of the agreements with the British?
I don't know Uganda specifically, although I've read that, now that you mention it. But actually the Germans were attempting to find places for the Jews to go outside of Germany.
And that had to have been what, before World War I? World War
Yeah, it was
II?
before World War II. It was before World War II. And this is not well known today, but the Nazis, again, National Socialist Party wanted to push the Jews out. They wanted to eradicate Germany of the Jewish population. And they were trying to convince the British to allow them to send them to Palestine, which made sense. But again, there was Arab resistance to that. So,
another question then, relative to the land and the promises. I've heard people say, you just mentioned the current saying is "from the river to the sea," meaning the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. But wasn't the land in these discussions, the Balfour and the rest, more than that?
It depends on which one you're looking at. There was various plans. Some of them, like the Transjordan plan during the World War I timeframe, was very large. It's a very large territory. What they settled on about the time that the war was over with, which extended all the way through until the Jewish War of Independence, was a division of the land between the Jews and the Arabs, which is within the basic parameters of the current state of Israel. And it had primarily the Jews along a strip along the Mediterranean Sea, down to Gaza, and then that was Arab. A little bit over toward the Jordan River, and then part of the Negev. The balance of the country, which is probably, I'm guessing from the map, about 60% of the country would have been Palestinian or Arab. about 40% Jewish, about 60% Arab, based on that land. I looked at that this morning, the map, just to refresh myself. But that's about what the layout was. And that was kind of similar to what the land was looking like around 1967 before that war occurred. And the Jews expanded their territory, took over the Western Bank, and also into Jerusalem itself.
Right. It was Gaza part of, who was that? I've heard people say that was really Egypt controlled Gaza.
They did, yeah, to some extent. There was also part of the mandate, as I recall, as part of the mandate. But it's always been that's always been an Arab territory.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's not been disputed in terms of the population there.
Well, till 2005, Israel was a military force in Gaza, and then they left completely in 2005.
Yes, that's correct. So the Oslo Agreement had them leaving the Gaza Strip.
But why were they there in Gaza then if it was Egyptian land?
Well, they weren't, at that point, it wasn't. And they were militarily in Gaza because of the attacks that were occurring. But so the Gaza and the West Bank were part of the Oslo Accords. And you're right, in the 2005 timeframe, there was a gradual withdrawal of military forces out of Gaza and a turning of the territory over to a Palestinian authority. And the idea was that there would be elections, free elections, that Palestinians would elect a government to control both there and the Western Bank and the West Bank. And that would be a democratically run operation. And Hamas got in. They got into the assembly, and they just took everything over in Gaza. They assumed and co-opted all of the governmental functions themselves. And so that happened in the post 2005 timeframe.
Okay. Can I jump in for 1 second?
Please.
Because I think you said something really important there, Dr. Bitner, in the distinction between Palestinians and Hamas. Because oftentimes, like our Western media, etc., like the distinction between those two things is incredibly fuzzy. So like what is the distinction there?
So Hamas is an organization, it's a terrorist organization that's supported by Iran that has taken control of the Gaza Strip. And you're correct. It's populated by Palestinians, but it's separate from and distinct from Palestine, the Palestinian people themselves. They rule, I wouldn't say govern, they rule the Gaza Strip and the people that are in the Gaza Strip. And if you're operating in Gaza Strip as a NGO, for example, or some other organization that's from the outside, you have to deal with them because they have. When I was in Bosnia, we had warlords. They were former Bosnian army officers, former Bosnian army officers that had a band of troops, and they had a territory, and they controlled it like a bridge. And if you crossed that bridge, you had to pay a fee or do whatever they wanted you to do. Well, it's the same kind of thing in Gaza. You had to deal with the Hamas and the local leadership of whatever they wanted you to do in order to be able to operate.
Sounds like warlords.
Well, to an extent, I think it is. Yeah.
And that's just so important to this discussion. It really is, because we struggle so much to deal with the nuance of a lot of these issues, and recognizing that there's a distinction between Palestinian Arabs as an ethnic people group and Hamas as an organization.
Right, and people get them mixed together and they assume they're the same thing, and they're not.
Yeah.
Let me ask a couple related questions. First of all, is Hamas limited to Gaza? I mean, are they only found in Gaza?
Primarily, yes. So we have Hamas there. We have Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And they're both supported by Iran.
Okay. Okay. And Dr. Bitner, what do you know about Christian Palestinians? What's the church like? Are there any Christians in Gaza, Palestinian Christians in Gaza, or I keep hearing about Palestinian Christians, and I guess my perception is that the only place those Christians are safe is actually in Israel. But I'm just curious what you know about the church in Palestine, or Palestinian Christians specifically.
I'm not familiar with what the demographic looks like in Gaza in terms of Palestinian Christians. I would think it would be a hostile environment for them, given the nature of Hamas, as opposed to being in Israel.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Christian Arabs.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. When I went to Israel back in 2019, our guide in Israel was a Palestinian Christian.
Yeah.
Yeah. So rather interesting. All right. Israel's called an occupier. You've already mentioned who the Palestinians are. It seems like all right. Anyway, there's a debate there. Why do they think they have right to all the land from the river to the sea?
Okay. In terms of the whole occupier concept, that gets back to a Marxist-based critical theory view of Western exploitation of indigenous peoples.
Okay.
So, and this is a common thought, a common thread. This is among universities and professors and students in the United States. This is a very common idea, and it's transposed from location to location to location, and it's all cookie cutter. So if you identify someone as the occupier and someone as the indigenous people, you have now defined the relationship and what should be done about it from their perspective. And that what should be done is the occupiers need to be defeated and removed, and the indigenous people need to be supported and helped. And that's kind of the basic approach. And so within this situation, those individuals who propose these theories have labeled the Jewish as the Western occupiers, as opposed to the indigenous people who are the Palestinians. And so that theory is applied to them, and that's kind of how all that's viewed today.
Why does Israel claim that they have a legal right then? Meaning they're saying we're not occupiers. We're back legally in the land.
Well, because the birthright, all the biblical perspective with regard to the land, which goes all the way back to Abraham. So, and they're claiming this from that perspective, and from a biblical perspective, we understand that and can see that. There's also the proportionality of the whole thing from the Israeli perspective. Israel is about 10,240 square miles. You can get this information from Wikipedia if you want to do it. Okay. And the Arab nation, the Arab world taken together, that goes from Iraq all the way over to Mauritania, is about 5,392,688 square miles. So Israel comprises 0.2% of all the territory that is under Arab control, regardless of where it's at across, and that does not include Pakistan or Afghanistan or Iran or Turkey, which are not Arab, even though they're Islamic. So the Israelis would say, and they do say, that what we're looking at in terms of a land for us to live in peaceably is 2.2% of the total of what the Arab nations control. And why can't we do that? So that's their perspective.
Hardly asking for a lot.
Yeah. Aren't they also appealing to some of these? You mentioned the Balfour, the British were making an agreement, even though they had a sort of a double tongue to do different groups promising.
So, yeah, if you look at these promises, I hate to bash the British, but in this case, they made promises to both groups of people. Yeah. So there's expectations among the Arabic Palestinians, and there's expectations among the Jews about how this is supposed to play out, and it didn't. So they both have grievances that are left unresolved, and these various attempts to resolve them, I think, if left to themselves, would have maybe worked out, except for intervention with groups like the PLO initially. Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is a past terrorist group, and currently with Hamas and Hezbollah, and because of Iran.
Yeah.
And Iran is kind of at the base of all of this. They're the ones who are supporting Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. This all Iranian operations.
Yeah. Sean, you can say something.
Yeah. I think, the issue of Israel's possession of the land is actually, it's very, very much a part of kind of an in-house discussion, within the church of how much Christians should support Israel and all those kinds of things. I think it's one of the big questions here is why do some Christians support Israel and others believe that the church has replaced Israel, and all those questions. And really,
right, yeah.
it as Dr. Bitner indicated, it goes back to the Abrahamic covenant. And like, for example, Genesis 13:14 and 15 says, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever.
Right, yeah.
Forever. And so this is why our theology of like replacement theology versus continuation, the idea that God still has a plan for Israel is such a big theological and important theological issue with ramifications for how, whether we support Israel or, what the role of the church is in these issues. Because, like I'm not a replacement theologian. I do not believe the church has replaced Israel. Israel is a physical nation that God has made promises to, and God has not made those promises to the church. The church is, when I know people who believe that the church is the new Israel, and they're in that spiritual sense is that we're now the part of the chosen people. We've been grafted into God's chosen people spiritually, but God has promised Israel certain things, such as possession of the land and other things. So those continue for the physical nation of Israel, which does dovetail into prophecy and the reality that the Great Tribulation, the 70th week of Daniel, the Great Tribulation, is very much focused on the nation of Israel, the physical nation of Israel. So just referring to Dr. Bittner's comment about the biblical justification for Israel claiming the land, I think is an important question that Christians have. And so I wanted to address that, because in addition to the promises of the British, which is unclear, what we have are the promises of God, and God has made these incredible promises to the nation of Israel, and in fact repeated them throughout the Old Testament. So it's I just believe that those who believe these promises to Israel will still come about in the future. They're actually dealing with the verses and not spiritualizing them. So I think it's an important issue of biblical interpretation and just biblical understanding of what God has actually said. So wanted to address that.
Okay.
Yeah. Dr. Bitner, you've been a military commander. Just step back and think in that role for a second, because it's not just Hamas. You mentioned Hezbollah to the north and the Syrians and Israel and the Houthis. How does it all fit together? What are they all trying to accomplish? Those nations that are working together against Israel is what I'm thinking. What do you see?
There's something common called the Ring of Fire. Qasem Soleimani, who the U.S. killed at Baghdad International Airport in January 2020, was the second most powerful man in Iran. He was commander of the Quds forces, and which was responsible for external activities, which included the killing of hundreds of Americans in Iraq during the course of that war there. he had put together a plan, according to H.R. McMaster, who is a contemporary of mine in the Army, that was designed to put pressure on Israel and to take pressure off Iran. And that would, the Ring of Fire includes all of those things going on around a 5-front attack in Gaza, the West Bank, and Syria, and southern Lebanon, and the Houthis launching of drones and missiles down in the Gulf of Aden, which is really kind of out of Israeli control to respond. That's an international response. And this was his idea, again, this is Iranian pressure on Israel with the ultimate objective of, from the river to the sea, to push them out or to eradicate them completely, and to allow to also to buy some breathing room. This is what I'm reading: breathing room for the Iranians to continue developing their nuclear capacities.
Yeah, are they really all working together against Israel? Is that what you're saying?
Well, what is the suggestion here is that the Iranians are masterminding the entire operation. They're coordinating the efforts and providing resources necessary for these kinds of things to happen. And when they look at the drone parts that's being used by the Houthis down south, there's a lot of Iranian stuff in those drones. So they're getting materials down to them so that they can be constructed by those rebels to use against international shipping going through that strait.
Yeah. Wow. We're stepping toward. You mentioned the Ring of Fire, and Sean, you were talking about God's promises to Israel, and we think of the prophetic elements. And I'm looking at our time here and going, so we were going to talk about in 1 minute Gog and Magog. No, we're not going to. That's beyond the nature of our discussion here. But Dr. Bitner, anything else you'd maybe like to say that we haven't covered here, just about how Christians could understand, and where should we go, and how should we relate to what's going on here in Israel?
Well, I think we have to look at this from a biblical worldview. For example, I mentioned critical theory and the whole oppressor perspective, which is a worldview that is not biblical. So I think we have to look at this through biblical lens and understand what's going on here. The nation of Israel, as I mentioned, is 0.2% of the total Arab world. And how much is that against the total of the world in terms of square miles is like minuscule. And yet, for centuries, this piece of land has been the focal point over and over and over again of stuff, of things, of conflicts, of crossroads of nations and empires have come and gone, and yet the Holy Land as an entity remains a focus of attention. And I find that doesn't happen in other places of the world. That happens only there, and there's a reason for that. Back to the biblical worldview, the Abrahamic promise. All of the events that have occurred there, I think everything goes right back to there again when you look at Revelation and Daniel.
Yeah, you bet. Well, guys, we run out of time, and there's so many other things we could ask and answer. Dr. Bitner, thanks so much for joining us for this conversation.
Well, thanks for asking. I appreciate it.
You bet. To our listeners, we encourage you to approach this with a biblical worldview. Don't do newspaper exegesis, do biblical exegesis there. Find out what the Bible says. You all have a great day, and thanks for joining us for a Calvary Conversation.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Calvary Conversations, a service of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. We invite you to participate in the conversation by contacting us through the Calvary University website, calvary.edu, or by calling us at 816-322-0110. Join us again next week for another Calvary Conversation.